All right. Thank you for listening to me read the Hope Chest again. There is so much history packed into the Hope Chest that we could spend hours and hours talking about it. But just to be brief today, kind of with some stuff that would be good for you to know. On the left there, this is a picture of inside the state capitol building of Tennessee. Every state has a state capitol building, and that's where the state government does their business. So that's where laws are passed and committees are formed to talk about how to best run the state. So when the women's suffrage vote is going to happen, it's going to happen in this building on the left. And you can see it's very tall. It's built kind of like a cathedral, so lots of arches. And so Chloe and Violet are actually going to go into the state capitol building today. And they're actually going to see bullet holes that are left over from the Civil War that were still there even 60 years later. So very interesting. And Violet's also going to learn a little bit about, politics might not quite be as, maybe a little more dangerous than she thought of. Maybe she finds out that there was an old governor of Tennessee that really wasn't a very honest guy and did some shady things. On the right, or there in the center of the page, this is a map of Central Europe in 1914. So about 6 years before this happens. Now, this map is actually, the shapes are all the same, but where each country is actually quite a bit different because this was before World War I and now World War I has passed. So we learn that Mr. Martin he was born in a place called Hungary. And you can see right there that there is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So much I could talk. So I listened to this podcast called Revolutions Podcast. And anyway, long story short, I'm listening to one on the Revolution right now, and I've listened to some previous ones about the rise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire will cease to exist after World War I. It will be broken up. And Hungary will kind of fall under the Russian Empire after that. And so remember, we talked about the Palmer agents, and they called Mr. Martin a socialist or a radical. They were worried that he was somebody that believed in the Russian form of government because Russia had just been taken over. Anyway, so they were worried that he was going to spread these ideas of running the government the Russian way, that he believed in that. They were worried about that. And so we learned a little bit more about that. So, yeah, very interesting. All right, let's get to reading. I'll stop talking about history, and we'll just get to reading. Let's see, what page am I on? Oh, 203. The street in front of the Capitol was full of Model Ts parked diagonally on both sides. Chloe slid the Hope Chest into an empty space, and they got out. Violet remembered her red rose and pulled it off, sticking it inside her hat in case she needed it later. "Doesn't it matter us going into the Capitol together when I'm pretending to be an anti?" she asked. "I don't think anyone's paying any attention at this point," said Chloe with a tired smile. "Both sides are panicking, just trying to figure out which side the legislators are on and when the vote is going to happen." "There are some Tennessee Suffs up here guarding the special House committee that's supposed to meet on the amendment tonight," Chloe said. Chloe nodded up at the Capitol. "What's the committee meeting supposed to do?" Violet asked as they climbed up the 72 stone steps toward the Capitol. Violet had heard that a Model T Ford had climbed these steps a few years ago to prove the superiority of automobiles to horse-drawn carriages. Violet wondered if Chloe would be willing to try driving the Hope Chest up these steps. She looked at Chloe's exhausted face and decided now was not a time to suggest it. A committee's job is to look at a bill and decide whether or not to send it to the floor to be voted on by the legislator, Chloe said, sounding weary. "In this case, it's a bill saying that Tennessee ratifies the Susan B. Anthony Amendment." She stopped to rest, leaning against the pedestal of a statue. "A week ago, we had a clear majority. Nearly 2/3 of the House members said they favored the bill. But thanks to the antis and their businessmen and mystery men, it now looks like the committee might not even vote to send the bill to the floor." "And if it does get sent to the floor," said Violet, moving around to see if there's any shade anywhere, "then it needs 3/4 vote to pass?" 3/4? No, only a majority. More than half of the House. That's all it needs. "In school, we learned," Violet frowned, trying to remember. It hadn't seemed nearly as important when they'd learned it in school as it did now. "A constitutional amendment requires 2/3 vote of Congress and 3/4 of the state legislatures." "That means the legislatures of 3/4 of the states," said Chloe. "In other words, 36 of the 48 states, and we've got 45.5 now. 35.5 now, but we don't need the Tennessee House itself to vote 3/4 in favor. All we need is a simple majority, and we are so close. She looked up at the old cannons that surrounded the Capitol, left over from the Civil War. Capitals are built on hills so they can be protected if the people revolt, said Chloe, looking up at the cannons and smiling. Violet guessed from the smile that Chloe had probably heard this from Mr. Martin. Why are the women antis even bothering? Violet asked. This had been on her mind for the last several days. If they're that much against voting, why don't they just not vote when they get the right? Some people are never satisfied unless they're making choices for other people, said Chloe. And, of course, a lot of the antis are funded by big business and by the political machines. Politics in this country is very corrupt, you know, Violet. Most elections are bought and sold. People sell their votes, and political machines in each city and state organizes the purchase of votes. Violet nodded, too out of breath from the heat and climbing to bother replying. The corrupt bosses don't want women to mess things up, Chloe went on. They've spent over a century building up the vote-buying system they've got now, and everything is so fine-tuned. If 27 million voters are suddenly added to the rolls for November elections, it will destroy their calculations. Violet moved around the statue again, still trying to find a spot of shade. Who is this fella? Chloe squinted up at the statue. Edward Ward Carmack. He was a newspaper editor who was gunned down in the streets of Nashville a few years ago. His murders were pardoned by the governor, not the governor they have now. Pardoned by the governor? Violet tried to look up at the statue silhouetted against the blazing white sun, but couldn't. They shot him down in the street in cold blood, and then they were pardoned by the governor? Well, I don't know if it was cold blood, said Chloe, patting the pedestal. Mr. Carmack might have drawn first, but in his newspaper he'd criticized the men who shot him, and he'd also criticized Governor Patterson. He was against the liquor interests, Mr. Carmack was, and Patterson was for them. Governor Patterson pardoned the killer before they'd spend a day in jail. So the governor of a state can just have people killed, people he doesn't like killed, said Violet. Nothing she had learned about government in school had suggested this. Oh, I doubt it's quite like that, Chloe said. Come on. As they climbed on, Violet looked back at the statue, suddenly struck with the idea that messing around in politics could be a deadly business. The liquor interests hadn't liked Mr. Carmack, and they didn't like suffragists either. In spite of the midday heat, Violet shivered. Inside the Capitol, the low, vaulted stone ceilings gave you the feeling you were underground. It was dark and felt cooler than outside. They climbed a wide stone staircase. Violet ran her hand over the cool stone handrail. There was a huge, jagged-looking gouge out of it. But when Violet touched it, she found it too was smooth, as if hands had worn it down for many years. Chloe noticed Violet was looking at it. That's from a bullet, she said. When the Tennessee legislature met after the Civil War, some of the legislators tried to escape because they didn't want to vote for Tennessee to rejoin the Union. But there were soldiers guarding them, and they opened fire. Violet stared at the gouge in the stair rail. No wonder Father thinks politics isn't safe for women. Chloe laughed. Well, I like to think once we're in, there'll be a little less gunplay involved. Anyway, you can see why the Tennessee legislators might be a little persnickety about having Yankees in here telling them what to do. Yeah, said Violet. She followed Chloe up the stairs. The second story was lighter, with a high stone ceiling. The hallway was shaped like a cross. At the end was the House of Representatives. At the other end was the Senate and the library. It all seemed oddly quiet after all the fuss and noise in the Hermitage and in the streets and in the train station during the last week. Thank goodness you're here, Miss Mayhew. Miss Pulitzer burst through a doorway. We need to work on 2 of the subcommittee members. Quick, we've lost them. I thought only Southern women were allowed to lobby with legislators here in the Capitol. They're not in the Capitol. I mean, we've lost them, said Miss Pulitzer. Blotz and Credwell. They've flown the coop. Do you know what they look like? I think so, said Chloe. Then, go, please, look for them. We've got search parties out. Mrs. Ann Dallas Dudley has gone to the Hermitage, and Miss Sue Shelton White is searching the moving picture shows and Skalowski's ice cream parlor. We have guards covering the train station, and I'm going down to check the interurban station on Broadway. But Credwell might have an automobile. We need someone to drive out the highway looking for them. Is the Hope Chest nearby? Myrtle and Mr. Martin were trying a variation on their diet of sardines, Unita biscuits, and peaches. Myrtle had gotten a can of tuna fish instead. Myrtle was setting the Unita biscuits neatly out on a napkin on Mrs. Reddy's oilcloth tabletop, and Mr. Martin was just slicing through the lid of a tuna fish can with his pocket knife when the door burst open. Should I stop there? I'll keep reading. A board fell off and it clattered. The door burst open. It hit the wall with a loud crack, and a board fell off of it and clattered to the floor. 2 men pounced into the room. They both had guns out, pointed at Mr. Martin. Myrtle dove into a corner. "Don't move, Arpadfi," one of the men barked. Mr. Martin raised his hands over his head. "I'm not Arpadfi." "Of course you are. Who else would be able to pronounce it? Drop the knife and that device you're holding in your game hand." Mr. Martin dropped the knife and the tuna fish on the floor. The knife stuck into the wooden floor. The can rolled lopsidedly, the smell of tuna fish rising from the oil dribbling out. The men peered at the can intently. "Not a bomb, just a can of tuna fish," one of them announced. "Cover him, Hank. I'm going to put the cuffs on him." The man who had spoken moved over behind Mr. Martin, grabbed his hands, and jerked them down behind Mr. Martin's back. Myrtle winced in sympathy. It was what that evil brakeman had done to her on the freight train. "Don't try nothing funny," said Hank. "Nobody cares if we shoot dangerous alien radicals." "I'm not an alien," said Mr. Martin. "I'm a U.S. citizen." "Uh-huh. And just when did you become a U.S. citizen, Arpadfi?" "My name is Theodore Martin, and I was born in the United States." "Let's drop the Martin, okay? You're Sandor Arpadfi, and you were born in some European country." "Hungary," the other agent put in. "Hungary, then, around 1892. And you came to the United States in 1897. You lost 3 fingers in an industrial accident in 1898, and your left eye in a knife fight in 1916. The man who was holding Mr. Martin's arms, he had the handcuffs hanging at his belt, Myrtle noticed, but he made no move to get them, traced the scar from Mr. Martin's eye downward with his finger. It must be a glass eye, Myrtle realized. Mr. Martin jerked his head away. "Resisting arrest," the agent commented, twisting Mr. Martin's arms more tightly behind his back. "It wasn't a knife fight," said Mr. Martin through clenched teeth. "The other man had a knife. I did not." "And I am a U.S. citizen." "Right. You became a citizen in 1913, said the agent. "In other words, you'd already become a radical. A radical can't become a U.S. citizen. I think the courts will find that your citizenship oath is null and void." Whew, looks like the law has finally caught up to Mr. Martin. So when they say that he was being a radical, they just meant that they thought that he believed in having a Russian form of government. That's the main thing. So we will learn more about Mr. Martin's fate tomorrow and in the upcoming days. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye. Oops.